Fidel Castro as global leader, his impact in Latin America, his role in Africa, his relationship with Russia, and his friendship with China. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Cubans continue to mourn their former leader Fidel Castro today, with thousands lining up to pay their respects in Havana. While he made revolutionary changes and transformed his country's direction for half a century, Fidel Castro is also remembered for the major role he played across the world. He supported and inspired leftist movements and leaders in Latin America. He was an early supporter of Nelson Mandela in his fight against apartheid in South Africa. He shared close links with Russia, and he was a friend to China. We will talk about all that in a few moments, but we begin with CCTV's Michael Voss, who joins us from Havana. And Michael, what's the latest there as Cubans continue to honor Fidel Castro?
Well, Anand, as you can probably see behind me, Havana's Revolution Square is really packed with people. In 1 hour's time, probably the biggest commemorative event of these 9 days of mourning for Fidel Castro will take place here. Now, apart from a short television address by President Raul Castro announcing his elder brother's death late Friday night, there have been no official government statements. So what we're expecting this evening is a major keynote address from Raul Castro in this square, packed with tens of thousands of Cubans, televised live throughout the country. A lot of international dignitaries are here, at least 20 heads of state, presidents and prime ministers. And obviously the majority of them are from Latin America and the Caribbean, but also a very large African contingent. As you mentioned in your introduction, Cuba played a major role in the wars of independence in Africa and to a degree with bringing about the end of apartheid. So a major presence here. South Africa's President Jacob Zuma is here. So is 92-year-old Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe. What's interesting is that there's a very low-key European turnout, and also we were waiting to hear whether the United States would send anyone here. We've just heard from the White House that they're not sending any official delegation to this event, but they will send the Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, along with the acting head of the embassy here, Jeffrey De Laurentiis, to the funeral in Santiago. Now remember, Ben Rhodes was the man involved in the secret negotiations that went on for a year and a half to restore diplomatic relations. So this is the big one tonight. For the last day and a half, we've had thousands of people going through Red Square to pay their respects. Fidel Castro's ashes will be taken across the country for the next few days for the final funeral in the second city, Santiago, on Sunday.
Michael, 9 days of mourning in Cuba. What happens over the next few days?
Well, really what happens over the next few days is they're having what they call this funeral caravan that will take Fidel Castro's ashes from Havana, the 900 kilometers by road to the second city, Santiago. It's the reverse course of his victory march after Batista had fled here, that he took his guerrilla army, all their tanks, their trucks, they went by road for 6 days through Cuba in a sort of victory march to Havana. They're reversing that one. What that will mean is that everyone in Cuba, even in remote rural areas, will get a chance to come down, see this caravan containing his ashes as it goes by, and pay their respects. And then there will be another major rally in Santiago on Saturday night, and then his funeral at the main cemetery in Santiago on Sunday. This is the cemetery where the remains of Jose Marti, Cuba's great independence hero, is buried. Many of the fighters who fell during the guerrilla battle in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and there are many of those who fought for Cuba's independence from Spain. It is a very symbolically important cemetery in Cuba. Anand.
Thanks, Michael. That's CCTV's Michael Voss reporting from Havana. Let's get to our panel right now. And joining me in the studio is Anton Fedyashin. He is a professor at American University and is a specialist on Russian history. Also joining us from Beijing is Jia Xiudong. He is a senior fellow with the China Institute of International Studies. Also with us in the studio is Piero Gleijeses. He is a professor of American foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University, and he's published and written widely on Fidel Castro's role in Africa. Piero, let me start with you. Castro is credited with having enormous influence among leaders in Latin America, in fact, among progressive leaders, leftist leaders around the world, but specifically Latin America. What impact did he have?
Well, the real impact, actually, of the Cuban Revolution is in Africa. In Latin America, there is the example, there is a generosity, eventually there has been humanitarian assistance, etc., etc. One can say that Fidel Castro was the stepfather of the Alliance for Progress, because the Alliance for Progress was a response to the Cuban Revolution to prevent a second Cuba, etc., etc. But this is not particularly important because the Alliance for Progress was a failure. Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution inspired many thousands of young people who fought for social justice in Latin America, but unfortunately their struggle failed. The guerrillas were defeated. It remains as a symbol of national independence, of dignity for the Latin American people. But again, the real contribution of the Cuban Revolution is in Africa.
Okay, I want to get to Africa in a minute, but Piero, let me ask you about the influence he had in Latin America on people like Hugo Chavez, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua.
Well, he had a great influence. The Cubans helped the Sandinistas since the creation of the Sandinista movement in the early 1960s. For the Sandinistas, during the very difficult years of the struggle against Somoza, the only safe place was Havana. The only place where their wounded would be cured and would be safe were Havana. When the Sandinistas came to power, they came to power feeling an immense debt of gratitude towards Cuba and an immense affection. I was in Nicaragua at the time, I witnessed it, etc., etc. Chavez, when he tried a coup in Venezuela in the 1990s, and he was arrested, when he was freed and he was a nobody, he was received in Havana by Fidel Castro. I was there when Fidel and Chavez gave speeches at university, etc. And so he had a lot of influence on Chavez. There is absolutely no question about it.
Right. Of course, he was a man who had influence throughout the world, was known throughout the world. Let's go to Beijing. Jia Xiudong, what was the relationship like between China and Cuba at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution?
Fidel Castro is remembered as an old friend of the Chinese people. People in China actually remember him as a well-known figure, a hero in Cuba, fighting against colonialism, dictatorships, and fighting for social justice. And he's remembered as the one who supported the non-aligned movement. So, you know, during the Cuban Revolution, that is only a few years after the founding of New China. So people in China began to learn what Fidel Castro was doing in Cuba. Shortly after the victory of the Cuban Revolution, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, Cuba became the first country in the Western Hemisphere to recognize diplomatically the new China. So people in China always remember this fact.
Anton, Fidel Castro came down from the mountains, overthrew the dictatorship in Cuba. How soon after that did he reach out to the Soviet Union, create an alliance with them?
Not terribly soon, as a matter of fact. There is a common misperception in the United States, understandably so because of the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis on relations with Cuba and the Soviet Union, that Fidel Castro was a Soviet puppet. And nothing's really further from the truth. The Soviet leadership didn't know what to make of the barbudos, the bearded guerrillas, when they came to power, because the Soviet Union wasn't following events in Cuba terribly closely. The rebels themselves took no orders from the Soviet Union, received no significant help whatsoever, and the Khrushchev regime actually had to figure out its policy towards Castro on a day-to-day basis, starting in early '59 when they come to power, and for the next 2 years. And the great irony of the American-Cuban relationship is that between the Eisenhower and the Kennedy administration, the U.S., in an ironic, sort of paradoxical sense, goes out of its way to push Castro towards the Soviet Union, which by 1961 is ready to receive him as a friendly leader in Latin America.
Did he initially reach out to the United States?
He did. When Castro made his first visit to the United States after the revolution, he had been here before in '59, there's a famous picture of his laying a wreath at the Lincoln Memorial, because the Cubans looked to the United States to support their sort of movement towards independence. There are many examples of CIA officers who had been working in the Caribbean feeling very pro-Castro in the very late '50s and in the early 1960s. I'll even give you a very seemingly strange example from popular fiction. Ian Fleming publishes For Your Eyes Only, one of the James Bond novels, in April of 1960, and in one of the 4 short stories that make it up, one of the British characters says that the British are very positively inclined towards the Castro regime because it's helping them to stem the flow of drugs in the Caribbean much more so than the Batista regime before. And no one can suspect Ian Fleming and the Bond character of being in any way pro-Soviet or leftist. So it's a very complicated and slow, gradual movement by Castro towards the Soviet Union.
Piero, so you have Fidel Castro. He comes to power in Cuba at the height of the Cold War. Suddenly, the Soviet Union has an ally in the Americas, very close to the United States, a neighbor of the United States. How did that change the dynamics of the Cold War?
Well, the Soviet Union, for a moment, agreed with Cuba that guerrilla warfare was the way in Latin America. In 1962, early 1963, the Soviet Union agreed with Cuba. And then Cuba became a very difficult ally for the Soviet Union, because Cuba continued to support armed struggle in Latin America, and the Soviet Union opposed it. The Soviet Union had a diplomatic offensive towards Latin American governments like Colombia, and Fidel Castro openly criticized the Soviet Union for their policy in Latin America, the kind of criticism of the Soviet Union that no ally of the United States would have dared make of the United States. Where Cuba started playing a particular role, Cuba had a dual policy: support for armed struggle in Latin America and support for liberation movements in Africa. Support for liberation movements in Africa, it went more or less along with Soviet policy. Cuban policy was totally independent, but the Soviets had no quarrels there. Support for armed struggle in Latin America clashed with Soviet policy. And Cuba was very critical of the Soviet Union, openly, in speeches. Once, talking with Mengistu in 1979, Raúl Castro said something amusing. He said, well, if they criticized us, we would say it was interference in our own affairs. But we could criticize them on every issue, including Soviet domestic politics, because by the late 60s, Fidel decided that Cuba was building communism much faster and better than the Soviet Union, and criticized Soviet policy in Vietnam, for instance. Vietnam became an important difference between Cuba and the Soviet Union, because Cuba was upset that the Soviet Union was giving such limited support in Vietnam.
Right. On Cuban policy in Africa, Fidel Castro's deployment of his troops in southern Africa. What was the relationship between Castro and Nelson Mandela and the ANC?
The relationship between Castro and Nelson Mandela was zero, because Nelson Mandela was in jail.
Right.
And Nelson Mandela wrote something very beautiful about how he felt when he heard that the Cuban troops had arrived in Angola in 1975. It was the first time that a foreign country, non-African, had come to Africa not to take something away, but to help. The relationship was with the ANC, right, with the leaders of the ANC. I mean, what Cuba did, Cuba in the 1960s had some minor covert operations in Africa.
Right.
Where Cuba started playing a decisive role was in 1975, when Cuba sent troops to stop a South African invasion of Angola, yes, to install in Luanda a government that would be a client of the South African, and was a joint covert operation of South Africa and the United States.
Right, okay.